The Arizona Territory, 1887. Dawn broke over the Mogollon Rim like a painter's first careful stroke across canvas, painting the pine-covered mountains in shades of gold and amber. Thomas McKenna adjusted his worn leather gloves and hefted his double-bit axe, feeling the familiar weight settle into his calloused hands. The morning air carried the sharp scent of pine sap and the promise of another scorching day ahead. At 34, Thomas had spent the better part of a decade working these mountains, cutting timber for the railroad expansion that was slowly but surely connecting the wild territories to civilization. His weathered face bore the marks of countless days under the harsh desert sun, and his broad shoulders spoke of years wielding heavy tools. Unlike many of the rough men who worked these camps, Thomas carried himself with a quiet dignity that earned him respect without demanding it. The lumber camp where he worked sat nestled in a valley between towering ponderosa pines, a collection of rough-hewn cabins and work sheds that housed about 40 men. Most were drifters, criminals running from something, or simply men who couldn't find their place in the increasingly civilized East. Thomas fell into none of these categories. He was here by choice, drawn by the solitude and honest work that the mountains provided. As he walked toward his assigned cutting area, Thomas noticed the unusual quiet that had settled over the forest. Even the birds seemed hesitant to break the morning silence. He'd learned to read the moods of these mountains, and something felt different today. The forest held its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. 2 hours into his work, with sweat already beading on his forehead despite the early hour, Thomas heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the cry of a child, weak and desperate, echoing through the trees like a ghost's whisper. He stopped mid-swing, his axe frozen in the air, straining to hear it again. There it was again, fainter this time, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Thomas knew these mountains well enough to understand that a child's voice out here meant trouble. The nearest settlement was 20 miles away, and the Apache reservations were even further. No family would bring a child into this wilderness without good reason. Setting down his axe, Thomas followed the sound, his boots crunching softly on the carpet of pine needles. The cry came again, and this time he could tell it was moving. Someone was traveling through the forest, and they were in distress. His pace quickened, driven by an instinct he couldn't name. After 15 minutes of careful tracking, Thomas found him. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with long black hair matted with dirt and sweat, and clothes that were little more than rags. He was Apache. That much was clear from his features and the traditional headband he wore. But what struck Thomas most was the boy's condition. He was emaciated, his ribs visible through his torn shirt, and his dark eyes held the hollow look of someone who had been hungry for far too long. The child had collapsed against the base of a massive pine tree, his small chest rising and falling with labored breaths. When he saw Thomas approaching, fear flashed across his face, and he tried to scramble backward, but he was too weak to move more than a few inches. "Easy there, son," Thomas said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. He knew enough about the Apache to understand that this boy had probably been taught to fear white men, and given the history between their peoples, that fear was entirely justified. The boy's lips moved, but no sound came out. His tongue darted out to wet his cracked lips, and Thomas realized with a pang of recognition that the child was dying of thirst and hunger. Without hesitation, he pulled out his water canteen, a habit that had saved his life more than once in this unforgiving country. "Here," Thomas said, slowly kneeling down and offering the canteen. "Water." The boy's eyes fixed on the canteen with desperate longing, but he still didn't move. Thomas understood. Trust was not something that came easily in this harsh land, especially between Apache and white settlers. Instead of forcing the issue, Thomas took a drink himself, then set the canteen down within the boy's reach before backing away a few steps. It took several long minutes, but eventually, the boy's thirst overcame his fear. He lunged for the canteen with shaking hands and drank greedily, water spilling down his chin as he gulped it down. Thomas watched quietly, his heart breaking at the sight of such desperate need. When the boy had drunk his fill, Thomas slowly approached again. This time, he pulled out a piece of hardtack from his pack. Not much, but it was food. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of it, and this time he didn't hesitate. He grabbed the hardtack and devoured it like a wild animal, barely chewing before swallowing. As the immediate edge of hunger and thirst was satisfied, the boy seemed to relax slightly. He looked up at Thomas with those dark, intelligent eyes, and for the first time, Thomas saw not just fear, but a spark of hope. "What's your name, son?" Thomas asked gently. The boy said something in Apache, his voice barely a whisper. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he caught the rhythm and cadence of a name, something that sounded like Ayana. "Ayana," Thomas repeated, and the boy nodded solemnly. Thomas pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said clearly. "Thomas." The boy tried to repeat it, but his pronunciation turned it into something that sounded more like Tomas. Thomas smiled and nodded encouragingly. As the morning wore on, Thomas found himself in a dilemma. He couldn't leave the boy here. Ayana would certainly die if left alone in the wilderness. But bringing an Apache child back to the lumber camp would create problems of its own. Many of the men there held deep prejudices against the Apache, born from years of conflict and mistrust. Looking at Ayana's face, however, Thomas knew there was really no choice at all. This was a child in need, and that trumped everything else. "Come on, son," Thomas said, standing and offering his hand. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Ayana looked at the outstretched hand for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took it. His small fingers were cold and thin, but his grip was surprisingly strong. As they walked back toward the lumber camp together, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything, though he had no idea just how profound that change would be. The lumber camp fell silent as Thomas emerged from the tree line, with Ayana walking beside him. 40 pairs of eyes turned to stare at the unlikely pair, the tall, weathered lumberjack and the small Apache boy whose hand rested trustingly in his. The reaction was immediate and predictable. "What in the hell do you think you're doing, McKenna?" The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, the camp's unofficial spokesman, and its most vocal advocate for keeping the Indians in their place. Morrison was a big man with a bigger mouth, and his face was already flushing red with anger. Thomas kept walking, his jaw set in a firm line. "Found this boy in the forest. He was starving. So you brought him here." Morrison stepped forward, blocking their path. "Are you out of your mind? That's Apache, McKenna. You know what they did to the Patterson family last year." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered men. Thomas felt Ayana's grip tighten on his hand, and he squeezed back reassuringly. The boy couldn't understand the words, but the hostile tone was universal. "That's enough, Morrison," Thomas said quietly, but his voice carried the kind of authority that made men listen. "He's just a boy. A boy today, a warrior tomorrow," spat another man from the crowd. "You're signing all our death warrants." Foreman Pete Garrett pushed through the crowd, his weathered face grim. Garrett was a fair man, but he was also responsible for the safety of everyone in the camp. "Thomas, I understand what you're trying to do, but Morrison's not entirely wrong. Having him here puts everyone at risk." Thomas looked around at the circle of faces, seeing fear, anger, and prejudice reflected in their eyes. These were hard men who had lived through the worst of the Apache wars, who had lost friends and family to raiding parties. Their hatred was real, born from real pain and loss. "Look at him," Thomas said simply, gesturing to Ayana. "Really look at him." The boy stood quietly beside Thomas, his dark eyes taking in the hostile faces around him with a composure that was remarkable for his age. Despite his obvious fear, he held himself with a dignity that was almost regal. His small chin was raised, and though his body trembled slightly, he met their stares without flinching. "He's dying," Thomas continued. "When I found him, he could barely stand. He's somebody's son, somebody's grandson. If it was your boy out there, wouldn't you want someone to help him?" The comparison hit home for some of the men. Thomas could see it in their faces, the slight softening around the eyes, the unconscious glances toward the photographs and letters from home that many of them kept. But Morrison wasn't backing down. "Your sympathy's going to get us all killed, McKenna. Mark my words." "Then what do you suggest?" Thomas asked. "Let him die. Is that what we've become?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. These men had come west for many reasons, some running from the law, others from broken lives, Still others, simply seeking fortune or adventure. But most had grown up believing in certain principles about right and wrong, about helping those in need. Foreman Garrett rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Tell you what, Thomas, the boy can stay for now, but you're responsible for him. Anything happens, anything at all, it's on your head. Morrison started to protest, but Garrett cut him off with a sharp look. That's my decision, Jake. You don't like it. You can find work elsewhere. Thomas nodded gratefully. Thank you, Pete. You won't regret this. As the crowd dispersed, still muttering among themselves, Thomas led Ayanna toward his small cabin at the edge of the camp. The structure was simple but solid. One room with a stone fireplace, a single bed, a table, and a few chairs. It wasn't much, but it was clean and dry. Ayanna entered hesitantly, his eyes wide as he took in his surroundings. Thomas realized that the boy had probably never been inside a white man's dwelling before. Everything would be strange and foreign to him. Hungry? Thomas asked, miming the act of eating. Ayanna nodded eagerly. Thomas began preparing a simple meal, bacon, beans, and coffee. As the food cooked, he watched Ayanna explore the cabin with the careful curiosity of a wild animal in a new environment. The boy's fingers traced the rough-hewn wood of the walls, marveling at the glass windows and the iron fixtures. When the food was ready, Thomas set 2 plates on the table and gestured for Ayanna to sit. The boy approached cautiously, clearly unsure of the etiquette. Thomas showed him how to use the fork and knife, and though Ayanna struggled with the unfamiliar utensils, he managed to eat without making too much of a mess. As they ate in comfortable silence, Thomas found himself studying the boy's face. Despite his obvious ordeal, there was an intelligence in Ayanna's eyes that impressed him. The boy was taking in everything, learning and adapting with remarkable speed. After the meal, Thomas pulled out his spare blankets and made a bed for Ayanna on the floor near the fireplace. The boy watched these preparations with growing amazement. The concept of sleeping indoors, on soft blankets, was clearly foreign to him. That night, as Thomas lay in his bed listening to Ayanna's quiet breathing, he wondered what he had gotten himself into. The boy was clearly lost, probably separated from his family during some kind of conflict or raid. But how had he ended up so far from any known Apache territory? And more importantly, what would happen when his people came looking for him? Outside, the night sounds of the forest seemed different somehow, more watchful, more attentive. Thomas found himself listening for sounds that didn't belong, for the whisper of moccasins on pine needles or the soft whinny of ponies. He had taken in an Apache child, and that single act of compassion had set in motion forces that he couldn't control or predict. But as he drifted off to sleep, Thomas felt no regret. Looking at Ayanna's peaceful face in the firelight, he knew he had done the right thing. Whatever consequences followed, he would face them when they came. 3 weeks passed, and the lumber camp settled into an uneasy routine with its newest resident. Ayanna proved to be remarkably adaptable, quickly learning the rhythms of camp life and showing an eagerness to help that surprised even Thomas. The boy's presence created a strange dynamic among the men. While some remained openly hostile, others began to view him with something approaching grudging respect. During the day, while Thomas worked, Ayanna would stay close to the cabin, helping with small tasks like gathering firewood or fetching water from the stream. His movements were quick and silent, and he had an uncanny ability to anticipate what was needed without being asked. It was clear that he came from a culture that valued practical skills and self-reliance. The boy's intelligence became apparent in other ways as well. Within a week, he had picked up enough English words to communicate basic needs and wants. Water, food, cold, tired. His vocabulary grew daily. Thomas, in turn, found himself learning Apache words, though his pronunciation left much to be desired. The breakthrough came on a warm afternoon when Thomas was teaching Ayanna to use some of the basic tools. The boy was fascinated by the axe, running his small fingers along the sharp edge with careful respect. Thomas demonstrated the proper stance and swing, and Ayanna watched with intense concentration. When Thomas handed him a smaller hatchet, Ayanna's face lit up with joy. His first few swings were awkward, but he learned quickly, his natural coordination serving him well. As he worked, he began to hum, a low, rhythmic tune that seemed to match the rhythm of his chopping. "What's that song?" Thomas asked, setting down his own axe to listen. Ayanna paused, searching for the English words. "Father, Father's song," he said haltingly. "He teach me." Thomas felt a pang of sadness. "Where is your father now?" The boy's face grew dark, and he looked away. "Gone," he whispered. "Soldiers come. Father fight. Not come back." The simple words painted a picture that Thomas understood all too well. The Apache wars had claimed victims on both sides, leaving behind widows and orphans, broken families, and bitter memories. This boy had lost his father to the violence, and probably his mother as well, given his condition when Thomas found him. "I'm sorry," Thomas said simply, placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. Ayanna looked up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. You good man, Tomas. Not like other white men." The words hit Thomas harder than he expected. In 3 simple sentences, this Apache child had managed to articulate something that many adults couldn't. The recognition that goodness and evil weren't determined by the color of one's skin or the culture of one's birth. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Thomas looked up to see a cloud of dust rising from the trail that led to the camp, and his heart began to beat faster. A group of riders was approaching, and from the way they sat their horses, he could tell they weren't whites. "Ayanna," he said quietly, "go inside the cabin. Stay there until I tell you it's safe." The boy's eyes widened with understanding and fear. He had heard the horses too, and he knew what their approach might mean. Without argument, he ran to the cabin and disappeared inside. Thomas picked up his rifle and walked toward the center of camp, where other men were already gathering. The riders emerged from the tree line, 6 Apache warriors, their faces painted with the traditional patterns of war. They rode with the easy grace of men born to the saddle, their eyes scanning the camp with practiced wariness. Foreman Garrett stepped forward, his own rifle held ready, but not quite pointed at the newcomers. The lead warrior, a man of perhaps 40 years with graying hair and scars that spoke of many battles, raised his hand in the universal gesture of peace. "We come to talk," the warrior said in heavily accented English. "We look for boy. Small boy lost." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. This was the moment he had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. The Apache had come for Ayanna. "What boy?" Garrett asked, though Thomas could see in his eyes that the foreman knew exactly what boy they meant. The warrior's gaze swept over the assembled men, finally settling on Thomas. There was something in that look, a recognition, perhaps, or simply the wisdom that comes from years of reading men's faces. "Boy with hunger," the warrior said. "Boy with fear. He is son of my daughter. His name is Ayanna." A murmur ran through the crowd of lumberjacks. Morrison stepped forward, his hand moving toward his pistol. "We don't have any Indian boy here," he said aggressively. The warrior's eyes flicked to Morrison, and Thomas saw something dangerous flash in those dark depths. These men had come in peace, but they were still warriors, and Morrison's hostile tone was not lost on them. "I do," Thomas said quietly, stepping forward. The admission caused a stir among his fellow workers, but he ignored them. "I found him in the forest. He was dying." The warrior studied Thomas carefully. "You are the one who feeds the boy." "Yes." "You give him water, food, place to sleep?" "Yes." The warrior dismounted from his horse, moving with fluid grace despite his age. He approached Thomas slowly, his eyes never leaving the lumberjack's face. When he was close enough to speak quietly, he said, "My name is Nailnish. Ayanna is my grandson." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Nailnish, he had heard that name before. This was no ordinary Apache warrior. This was one of their war chiefs, a man who had led raids against settlements and fought the U.S. Army to a standstill more than once. "I am Thomas McKenna," he replied, meeting the chief's gaze steadily. Nailnish nodded slowly. "You could have left him to die. Why did you not?" The question was simple, but Thomas sensed that his answer would determine what happened next, not just to him, but to everyone in the camp. "Because he was a child in need," Thomas said simply. That's all that mattered. The 2 men stood in silence for a long moment, each taking the measure of the other. Thomas could hear the nervous shuffling of his fellow workers behind him, could feel their fear and tension like a physical presence. But he kept his eyes on Nailnish, waiting. Finally, the Apache chief smiled, a small, sad expression that transformed his weathered features. "You speak truth," he said. "I see it in your eyes. May I see the boy?" Thomas nodded and called toward the cabin. "Ayanna, come out, son. Your grandfather is here." The cabin door opened slowly, and Ayanna emerged, his small form silhouetted against the doorway. When he saw Nailnish, his face transformed with joy and relief. He ran toward his grandfather, calling out in rapid Apache. The chief caught the boy in his arms, lifting him off the ground in a fierce embrace. The reunion was deeply moving, even to the hardened men of the lumber camp. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes as he watched grandfather and grandson hold each other, their words flowing in the musical cadence of their native tongue. Nailnish's weathered hand smoothed Ayanna's hair, and the boy's small arms clung tightly around his grandfather's neck. After several minutes, Nailnish set Ayanna down, but kept one hand on the boy's shoulder. He spoke to him in Apache, his voice gentle but serious. Thomas could see the boy nodding, occasionally glancing back at him with something that looked like gratitude. Finally, Nailnish turned back to Thomas. "My grandson tells me many things," he said. "He says you are kind to him. You teach him white man's ways, but you do not try to make him forget Apache ways." Thomas nodded. "He's a good boy. He has much to teach as well as learn." "He says you protect him from men who would hurt him," Nailnish continued, his eyes flicking toward Morrison and the other hostile workers. "This is true. There were some disagreements," Thomas admitted, "but Ayanna was never in danger." Nailnish studied him for another long moment, then spoke rapidly to his warriors in Apache. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could see surprise and even confusion on their faces. Whatever the chief was saying, it wasn't what they expected to hear. "Thomas McKenna," Nailnish said formally, "you have shown great kindness to my family. In our tradition, such kindness creates bonds that cannot be broken. You have fed my grandson when he was hungry, given him water when he thirsted, sheltered him when he was lost. These are sacred acts." The chief reached into his medicine bag and withdrew something small and dark. As he held it up, Thomas could see it was a small piece of carved stone, a bear, rendered with exquisite detail despite its tiny size. "This belonged to my son," Nailnish said quietly. "Ayanna's father. He was killed by soldiers 6 months ago when they attacked our camp. His wife, my daughter, died of grief 2 weeks later. Ayanna has been lost since then, wandering the mountains, looking for his dead parents." The simple words painted a picture of tragedy that made Thomas's chest tighten. This child had lost everything: parents, home, security. No wonder he had been so desperate when Thomas found him. "I give this to you," Nailnish continued, pressing the carved bear into Thomas's hand. "It will mark you as a friend of our people. Any Apache who sees this will know that you are under our protection." Thomas looked down at the small carving, feeling its weight. Not just the physical weight, but the significance of what was being offered. In a time when Apache and white settlers were locked in bitter conflict, this was an extraordinary gesture. "I'm honored," Thomas said simply. But Nailnish wasn't finished. He turned to address the entire camp, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Hear me, white men. This man, Thomas McKenna, is now brother to the Apache. Any who harm him harm us. Any who threaten him threaten us. This is our word." The implications of this statement sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Some of the men looked frightened, others angry. Morrison's face was red with fury. "You can't just declare," Morrison began, but Nailnish cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I am Nailnish," the chief said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "My word is law among my people. We do not make such bonds lightly, but when we make them, they are unbreakable." He turned back to Thomas. "My grandson wishes to stay with you for a time. He says he wants to learn more white man's ways, to understand both worlds. If you are willing, I will allow this." Thomas was stunned. He had expected the Apache to take Ayanna and disappear back into the mountains. The offer to let the boy stay was unexpected and generous. "I would be honored to have him," Thomas said. Nailnish smiled. Good, but he will not stay as a guest. Among our people, when a man takes responsibility for a child, that child becomes his son in all ways that matter. If you accept this, Ayana will be your son, and you will be his father. This is a bond that lasts forever. The magnitude of what was being offered hit Thomas like a physical blow. To become Ayana's adoptive father would mean taking on responsibilities that went far beyond simply providing food and shelter. It would mean becoming part of an Apache family, bound by traditions and obligations that he barely understood. But as he looked at Ayana's hopeful face, Thomas knew there was only one answer he could give. I accept, he said simply. Nailnish nodded solemnly, then spoke to Ayana in rapid Apache. The boy's face lit up with joy, and he ran to Thomas, wrapping his arms around the lumberjack's waist. Father, Ayana said in English, looking up at Thomas with shining eyes. My new father. The ceremony that followed was simple but profound. Nailnish spoke words in Apache that Thomas didn't understand, but their meaning was clear from the solemnity with which they were delivered. He placed Ayana's small hand in Thomas's larger one, binding them together with strips of leather, while speaking what were clearly ancient words of adoption and protection. When it was finished, Nailnish embraced Thomas as a son-in-law would be embraced, and the other Apache warriors nodded their approval. The bond had been forged, witnessed by both peoples. As the Apache prepared to leave, Nailnish pulled Thomas aside one final time. The boy will need to learn both ways, he said quietly. Apache ways and white ways. Only by understanding both can he find his place in the world that is coming. I understand, Thomas replied. We will return in the spring, Nailnish said, to see how he grows, to teach him things that only Apache can teach. But he is your son now, in all ways that matter. With that, the Apache mounted their horses and rode away, disappearing into the forest as silently as they had come. Thomas stood watching until the last rider vanished from sight, his hand resting on Ayana's shoulder. The lumber camp was quiet as the men dispersed, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had witnessed. Some were clearly troubled by the alliance that had been forged, while others seemed almost relieved that they now had Apache protection rather than Apache enmity. Morrison approached Thomas as he and Ayana walked back to their cabin. You have any idea what you've done? He asked angrily. Thomas looked at him calmly. I've gained a son, he said simply. You've tied us all to a bunch of savages. Morrison spat. No, Thomas replied, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Morrison step back. I've built a bridge between two peoples who need to learn to live together. Whether you cross that bridge or burn it down is up to you. That night, as Thomas tucked Ayana into his bed, Thomas had given the boy his own bed and taken the floor. The child looked up at him with serious eyes. Thank you, Father, he said in careful English, for everything. Thomas smiled and ruffled the boy's dark hair. Thank you, son, for teaching me that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about choice. As he settled down for sleep, Thomas reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. 3 weeks ago, he had been a solitary lumberjack with no family and few friends. Now he was the adoptive father of an Apache boy and the brother of an Apache war chief. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also the most meaningful thing he had ever done. Outside, the mountain night was peaceful, filled with the sounds of wind in the pines and the distant call of an owl. But Thomas knew that this peace was fragile, dependent on the bridges of understanding that people like him and Nailnish were trying to build. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The bond between a lonely lumberjack and a lost Apache boy had created something larger than either of them could have imagined. It had created hope for a world where two peoples might learn to see each other not as enemies, but as human beings deserving of respect and compassion. And in that small cabin on the edge of the wilderness, that hope was enough to light the darkness and warm the heart of a man who had finally found his true purpose in life. If you made it this far, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss our upcoming stories. Let us know in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. Your support motivates us to keep creating content like this. Thanks for joining us.